All right. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the founding of CERIAS at this symposium this year. And there are a lot of other things that we could celebrate as anniversaries in security. I think it's important to note, especially for some of the students and the younger people here, security has been around in the realm of computing and IT for far longer than CERIAS has been. It easily dates back into the 1950s. We can find references at that time to issues of securing computer systems and worrying about insider threats. And as time went on and computing became more widespread, cheaper to acquire, and we started trusting computers more, then we had an increased set of concerns. That was even before networking. So at one time, mainframes that were developed and deployed, any organization that ran them hired data auditors who would do the same calculations as the computer to make sure that the computer was working correctly. So it wasn't until years had gone by that we could do away with some of those human double checking because we started believing the results we got out of the computers. But there were concerns. There were concerns by large companies and certainly by the government. And those led to a number of innovations, developments, and need for people. The four panelists that are up here today all have multiple decades of experience, and I won't embarrass anyone by saying how many decades, but all have contributed greatly to the field in various ways. You can read their bios in the brochure, but I'll mention that we have people here who worked in government, in industry, at one of the certs, has worked as an analyst for a major organization that looks across the field. Someone who did some of the very early formal model work that is cited today. I don't think there will ever be a model that has my name in it, like David Bell. So if anybody has not heard of the Bell-LaPadula model, then you probably aren't in the business. But let me also note that David has incredible taste. I think it was last year I had an auction of my bow ties. He is wearing one of my former bow ties that he bought in the auction.
I wasn't sure he'd recognize it.
When I saw him this morning, I looked at it and I go, I used to have a tie like, oh, yes. So I've known these gentlemen for many years. I went to grad school with Carter, and Dickie seems like a fixture as well in the scene. I've known Bill for quite a while. So I'm going to ask them some questions so we can look back at history of information security, computer security, cybersecurity, if we must use the term. And I think Bill was present at the meeting where I really pushed back on Senator Sam Nunn, whose committee had started using the term cybersecurity. I still hate the term, but I think we can say that it is never successful to argue with a sitting senator. So with that aside, let me start by asking the members of the committee to say a few words each about how they got into the field, what their background was, how they got into it, and why they continued in the field of security. So, David, do you want
to? Well, after I finished my PhD in mathematics and category theory, fairly abstract, was in the middle of a business recession, and I went to work for a company called Mitre Corporation up in Massachusetts, and spent most of my time in the library trying to learn about computers. And the first year, Len LaPadula and I worked on data sharing. We thought that was going to make our name. And the following year, we were asked to work in security, and after we talked about it briefly, we said that's really going to be boring, but I guess we will do it. I did manage to spend 8 years outside of security, just building systems for the Air Force, or MITRE build system for the Air Force. But then I was brought back into the field and I went to the center.
Hi, I'm Carter Bullard. I might be the practitioner up here on the panel. I started in 1983. I had the privilege of being the guy who ran the network at Georgia Tech. And at the time, the Legion of Doom was launching attacks against Equifax. And I was asked to see if we could figure out what was going on. And I started the development of a piece of software called Argus that was used to just watch the TCP connections that were going in and out of Georgia Tech. And the FBI liked that, and it helped them find some students that were involved in the Legion of Doom. When the Morris worm hit Georgia Tech, I owned the network, and it was crushed, destroyed. And my tools were the first thing that died. I mean, it just melted down immediately. But I became the first responder, and we ended up with a core dump of the Morris worm. I shared it with Gene and Berkeley, and that started an incredible academic sort of treatise on the Morris worm, and I felt like I was the singular butterfly wing beat, you know, in that process, but it was great to contribute to that. But that started my career in cybersecurity. I was recruited at the CERT when they first started at Carnegie Mellon, and I built cyber incident response tools and started the first vulnerability laboratory at Carnegie Mellon to study how people attack infrastructure.
So when I got out of school in 1970, as a mathematician, you could either teach or program. Then some guy stopped by campus and said, "Do you like puzzles? Do you like games?" And I asked him a lot more about what he was doing, and he basically said, "Do you like puzzles? Do you like games?" And so I said, "Yeah, I do like games, and I do like puzzles." So I went to NSA, and I was there for a little over 40 years. Now I'm on my second career, but it's been security the whole time.
I kind of bopped in and out. My freshman year at a technical school downstream from Harvard, I played with a couple of friends of mine on hacking Multics. There was a program called Cookie. They never could find it. With its 6 rings of protection, we found a gap. And it would ask, you know, I want a cookie. And if you typed in the word cookie, it would disappear. And the 6th time, if you didn't respond, it would crash your session. So that was my first computer security per se. I've been in IT a lot longer, actually. I should confess, my mom was a computer. During 1944 through 46, my mother worked for the U.S. Navy, and she was one of the many women who participated in doing the calculations that helped arm and aim battleship guns. And her title was computer in the U.S. Navy, so I go back a ways. Been in and out of security since at IBM in the 80s. I helped guide MVS through C2 and B1 certification. At Gartner in the 90s, I founded and ran the Information Security Service. But yeah, it's always been in the back of my mind. And watch out for those students who have too much spare time.
So I think one thing that's notable here is, in large part, none of these people started off in security. And in some cases, computer security wasn't even a defined field at the time. It was more looking at the data or at some of the other issues. So many of us got our start in something else and then got pulled into the area, and the area developed around us. A comment that Bill made earlier when I was asking about developments was that a lot of what we did at the time sort of got paved over. We did a lot of work, and it didn't really get ignored, although some of it did. But much of it sort of got paved over by events, by new technologies and new companies. I made the comment to Dickie about how many of you remember C2 by 92? So a few of us in the room remember that. I'd be interested, and I think the audience would, if you want to make some comments about what are some technologies that were developed that probably ended too soon, that the market overtook and we forgot about, although we shouldn't have, that had they been developed, we might be in a better circumstance we are now. I'm sure you all have at least one story like that.
One in particular, it's very interesting. So in the early 90s, PKI was a big deal, or huge deal. And there were a number of companies that came, especially Canadian companies. Somehow, I think the Canadians like to sit in the winter and type a lot, and they do a lot of technology.
Well, expand PKI for the audience.
Oh, the public key infrastructure. The notion of having everybody has a digital certificate, and then the management of that certificate so that applications and people get access to, say, your public keys, so that you could use it for authentication, identification, and things like that. And it was a huge investment in the industry to try to develop PKIs for countries. And it just went nowhere. And it was a very fascinating type of thing that it didn't catch on, because it's something that is now exists, though, but it's in our chips and our phones and things like that. But it's something that had the promise of getting a national sort of recognition on cybersecurity, on identification and authorization and authentication. But it just fell off the table. And it could have been a cost thing. It could have been an onerous thing. People didn't want to be identified. It's hard to know exactly why it failed, but it failed miserably in the early 90s.
Well, as I recall, that was also about the time where there was a push by government to have encryption that could be broken by authorities. So
Clipper.
if we look at the Clipper chip and the like, and so the backlash to that may have been a factor in getting people not to be interested in adopting that for fear of what it might be forced to use. I'm speculating. Any of you?
It also was hard to use. And the people who were doing the deep research and extension made it more and more complex all the time and didn't make it easy for people to use. So when there were, I ran a small independent research project, which was going to get actual PKI out into something that MITRE Corporation actually used. And I suggested, how about the travel records? And they said, absolutely not. Nothing like that. And the difficulty in putting something together that was relatively small, that you could extend to 100 or 1,000 people, that it was so steep, the effort was so steep, and the notion at the time was that, like the speech this morning, you required far too much of the secretaries to try to make use of it. It was too complicated for real use. It wasn't ready for prime time.
So one of the development areas that I had in mind, it was the whole area of standards for building systems and operating systems that were developed out of the National Computer Security Center, some by NIST afterwards. Huge investment. You were directly involved in that. And even though jokingly the C2 by 92 was an attempt to get all commercial systems to meet the C2 level of certification, a lot of that just went by the wayside because it was too expensive, too difficult to get systems to do that. But prior, I remember pretty much every company had a federal systems division that had a trusted version of their product. Sun, DEC, IBM, those were the big ones, Data General. So was there value in that? Did we lose it too soon?
Yeah, there was value. The problem was that led to that was that the federal government stopped being able to drive industry. At one point in time, back in the 60s and 70s, the federal government was the big customer for all of these products. And once that stopped being true, then the federal standards really, it led to cost, complexity, difficulty, but it really was time. And time was the key. So an example, one of our early projects was a Vincent, a handheld radio that we put out in the field. We designed that in 1957. We analyzed it until 1968, and we fielded it in 1976. So that's about 19 years. That's not going to work in a commercial market space, and that's the problem. If you can take 19 years to build something right, you can in fact build it right. That's still out there. It's never been modified. And as far as we know, it's got no problems. But it's 19 years.
Another thing I will note is that when the Computer Security Center was put together, with 3 goals, one of which was the Orange Book, a way of measuring things, an organization to do it, and requirements for people to use it. For the government, if the government's going to buy it, it's going to do that. And the intent was to get away from what Spaff just talked about. Here's the federal systems, you know, the B team, and here's the real commercial product where you get the money and the plaudits, and that's the A team. And start selling the commercial product. When they got ready, they had worked on that close to 10 years, figuring it out, what you needed to do. And two things happened. Cycles quickened, and networks, which used to be leased lines, point to point, ARPANET started actually becoming important as they were getting rid of the previous one, which I can't remember right now. Because that relatively short time of only 10 years to figure out what to do, increased cycle times for building commercial products and networks. They didn't have 10 years to figure out how to do the networks right. And that we were in the process of writing standards as the technology was changing, and we didn't have 10 years to do it. And we were behind the 8 ball. We knew we were behind the 8 ball, and we never recovered.
Well, there was the Red Book, but it didn't really solve a lot of the problems.
Well, that was the best effort in the situation you had. It said, if you have to project into the future how you're going to use those kinds of principles that worked and have been, you know, brass-boarded, and estimate what you can do in networks, that's the best you can do. Well, we knew it was probably much was wrong with it, but it was the best that we could do in the time.
And then we went from there. People wanted to have some kind of certification. And so we ended up with a common criteria, which isn't, yes, it isn't a lot faster. And Bill, from your time looking at the marketplace, do you have any sense of how common criteria was accepted or used in the commercial marketplace?
Unfortunately, I think the common criteria fell short. One of the first products that was certified at, I think, EAL4 was, I think, Windows 95 or something. It was bizarre that it would get that level rating. Apologies to my good friends at Microsoft. I want to get back to your earlier question, if I could, just about what we missed. Because I think there's a crisis brewing in information security, and the crisis is a lack of philosophical foundations. Let me explain that. Back in the 80s, Peter Nauer said that this isn't software engineering and it's not computer science. Because in engineering you have a set of rules and principles, and in science you have a set of discovered facts that are axiomatic. What he called this field is datology, by analogy to psychology. Okay? We need to think about it differently, and we haven't yet begun to. Harlan Mills used to say that when civil engineering was as new as what we do, they hadn't even discovered what a right-angled triangle was. We are in the very, very early age. Folks, we're at the brink of the computer era. We're on the verge of the IT-enabled world. We almost have enough data to be able to make useful models predicting the financial success of corporations. Can't yet do that. We can barely follow crowds. We're a long way from there. One of the things that I wish we'd done more of, and those of you who are familiar with it are going to laugh, I took a class on computer languages, and my project was on Algol 68. Anybody remember? I hear the laughter. 4 levels of documentation written in different fonts for the book, a 28-pass compiler, just a magnificent structure. What it pointed to was the fact that because we don't have a philosophical basis for discussing IT and IT security, we get into infinite recursion. We're thinking tactically, and this is Mark's point. We have big issues that we need to approach from a philosophical perspective, and yet we're drowning in tactical issues. So I'd hope that we could get back to a bigger sense of what it is that we're actually trying to do, to step back a moment and use our deeper capacities to say, now what is the core problem? Everybody I worked with at Gartner and everybody I worked with at IBM who was involved with information security came to the same realization after about their second year, which is the first thing you see is these problems resolve themselves into either a technical glitch, right? Security defects are a subset of defects, so the problem is how do you write clean code? And then the other problem is that people click on things they shouldn't do. More generally, people behave in a manner that does not improve the security posture of the organization. And so those are the two areas I think that we need to look at if we're going to resolve security is how do we develop better code and how do we do better human interface? And that's why I like your PhD student's thesis on the interface. I think she should have a slot.
Well, I think you bring up a point that's important, and it goes to something I've heard Carter say, where we don't really define security very well. It's usually subjective according to organization. So your company would have a very different view than a government agency. And so Carter's talked about this as East Coast and West Coast security.
Yeah.
As East Coast, well, I'll let you describe it.
Yeah, I think of the East Coast as where the Rainbow series started, where formal methods and security were actually thought of before even any of this technology emerged. And they came up with the, not common criteria, but the things that were necessary to secure an abstract, theoretical computing environment. And that's gone if you go to the West Coast. The West Coast is interested in making money. What kind of small company can I build and what kind of market can I exploit to make money in the shortest amount of time? So things like firewalls, which are wonderful devices. I'm never going to complain about firewalls. But firewalls are very simple, trivial devices. I got a packet, I'm going to go run through a bunch of rules, and I'm either going to throw it away or I'm going to let it on the wire. Right? That's 20 years of security based on a decision to throw a packet away or not is not a learned, deep thought solution to the complex problem that we now are faced with. And I think that I still have in many of my slides, I do stuff with the National Science Foundation and a bunch of stuff with many of the agencies that are represented around here. I have the Rainbow series in my slides because I talk about the fact that they at least had a simple set of rules. We got to have accountability for this area. So, and where is the accountability? But when you are looking for an investor, if you're looking for a market, the entire market has been engineered by what I call West Coast security into a very simple set of criteria, and then you'll be secure. Encryption, PPI, let's protect your personal private information, and maybe some firewall rules embedded in either Apple's devices or Microsoft devices. That's about it, in terms of what the public understands is protection. And I think that that's the huge split that happened over all the years is the markets and the money created a set of solutions that were lacking. And the formalisms needed to really drive the industry got disconnected.
Well, I think it illustrates some of what Mark said when he was giving his talk, that the average CISO at an organization is dealing with 55 different products because the underlying systems are built to different purposes. Not very assured construction mechanisms. We still don't know how to do that very well. This is the 30th anniversary of the internet worm coming out, which changed a lot of what we did in the field back in '88. That suddenly it went from an environment where we were concerned about protecting what was on individual systems to this whole idea of self-propagating software and what that could do because of software flaws, because of lack of good controls at perimeters, not having firewalls, some of those kinds of issues. And that was enabled by a buffer overflow, which had first been documented in the 1960s, and we still have vendors building in buffer overflows that are being reported as security vulnerabilities today, 50 years later. So we haven't done a good job of learning simple things. You were going to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about East Coast, West Coast. I think East Coast, West Coast differences make a lot of sense from the 90s. I started in the 60s. And in this, the Orange Book built on a set of systems that were built to be extremely secure. KVM, West Coast. PSOS, West Coast. KSOS, I forget where they were, Minnesota and somewhere. And a bunch of work that was done on the East Coast. There was also a bunch of work that was done in Europe that was brought in and actually made some problems. So the West Coast pursuit of money, I think, happened in the middle.
Yeah, pretty certainly there were a number of firms, Minnesota, Secure Computing, and then became part of McAfee Labs, and our first firewall out of there.
Well, the great Midwest America did some really good work. So.
Yes, it did. Yeah, we've had that value here all along. But we've lost something with all of that, right? We've had this incredible technological change that has resulted in 8 or 9 orders of magnitude increase in capacity and speed, and an 8 or 9 orders of magnitude decrease in cost. So we've gone from mainframes that cost the equivalent of $42 million a piece that had to be shared, and we built for that shared environment, to now where we have sensors that are so small that have their own computing and memory that we don't even know that they're there. So what I believe, but I'd be interested in getting your opinion, some of the decisions we made back when computing was very expensive, and we had to share it, and we had to find ways to let multiple people have access, which then led to concerns about how to protect sharing on those systems that led to some of these other difficulties, have mutated now that we have billions, trillions of computing devices possible. Any comments to that?
Well, we don't really have a good threat adversary model. And we don't have any way of addressing the small model that we have. The change from, if you look at Mark brought up the car, and I thought that was an interesting analogy, because the car is built for a pretty benign atmosphere. It's the environment is, nobody's out there trying to shoot at the car.
Not around here.
No.
Yeah.
Right. And where they are, it's not really a safe product. So the threat adversary model, when we started, if you look at ARPANET, it was basically designed with that threat adversary model. Everybody was going to be sharing information. This was designed as government, academia type thing. We just haven't progressed very far from that. And if you look at, harking back to that Vincent, we spent 6 months with the engineering diagrams for that Vincent, breaking down every line, every register stage, every transistor in that thing to see what could possibly go wrong. It's inconceivable that you can do that with a computer. You can't even do that with an operating system. And so the security we could build in the 60s and 70s, we can't build into that.
Well, the complexity has certainly increased, and as Mark noted, and I think many of us know, increasing the complexity, we have an exponential growth in the number of possible attacks. It's not linear in the size, and we don't do a very good job of compartmentalizing or encapsulating some of our risk. And part of that, I believe, again, going back and looking at things we developed before, we have chosen to really embed the idea of minor evolutionary steps in products. That revolutionary steps in design of new processors, new models of operating systems, new languages or development methods don't occur very often because they're not adopted by the West Coast mentality of the spending. So you've all probably seen some interesting developments that didn't get that capital or didn't get that traction. Are there any that come to mind that you think might still be worth pursuing today?
You're talking about products.
Products or ideas? We didn't rehearse these.
No, we sure did.
Did you notice? Well, there was an idea that most of my work has been with various parts of government. And in the government, they actually explicitly divide up networks and systems. But in all cases, there's some reason that they just have to have a little connection over here if you don't worry about it too much. Well, and things get worse and worse. Isn't that the entropy view of systems? Things get worse. Because those kinds of systems are divided that way. Here's one, and here's the little tiny connection. Here's one, little tiny. we actually had the possibility of focusing old-fashioned attention on those places, but we didn't. Now, it would be perfectly possible to use more niche products, specially designed products for some of those gateways. But what do they use?
Commodity system.
Trusted CERIAS or something like that. And it has none of the right properties for what you're trying to do. And the major difficulty when people looked at it when I was involved was it won't go fast enough. That has fixed. I mean, that has improved. I don't know if it continues to be not fast enough, but shortly after the attacks, I unretired. And I supported the U.S. Air Force, the CIO. And I went in the first day, and having worked at Energy, and I had to bring my own computer. I came in the first day with the computer that you can't attach. That's your computer there. And there was no external drive. If I had a need to do something, I had to actually move it within the network over there, go to a different physical room where they could do it. They could go from secret to unclassified, and they audited me, and then I could take it away. They don't do anything like that as far as I can tell. We've had some recent major problems that resulted because somebody walked out. One guy walked out with a CD he burned, and other people took the USBs home, and then they got spearphished.
Yeah, well, in a lot of these environments today, it is difficult for some of our younger colleagues to enforce the right discipline and leave their cell phones outside because they're so used to carrying them. And it's a known risk. Again, it's that kind of threat model. It is understood in some environments, not others, but we become so used to that threat model, like Facebook, that we're really loath to give it up, even in circumstances where we need it.
Let me tell you an old story that's parallel to that. I was working at MITRE in the 70s when Hewlett-Packard came out with the kit to make a 4-function calculator. You could not bring a calculator into MITRE.
Well, I can remember when you couldn't bring a Furby into NSA because they were afraid it would speak confidential.
Yeah. Yeah. If the Furby reference doesn't resonate with any of you, I'm sure Wikipedia has something on it. But
there are some bright lights out there, though, that are using old technology and making it work. But I think you have to follow the money. So look at American Express and their fraud detection algorithms. It's so wonderful. You go and you buy something, and in 10 seconds, I've got on my phone, oh, you just bought something from somebody, you know. And if you're in a different city, somebody's going to call you up and say it's okay in real time. Now, that isn't crazy stuff. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that has been worked on since the 90s. And it's evolved to a point where it's very good. But where is that for computational devices? Where is that for files? Where is that for anything that doesn't have a massive money tag on it? So I've had the privilege to talk to a lot of banks and about their cybersecurity environments. And the first thing I ask them is, how do you deal with fraud and money laundering and things like that? And to hear the controls they have on money. I heard a bank talk to me about their money honeypot, where they can create accounts that look into the system like it's got a couple $1 million in it. That's not real. It's there purely to attract people to see if they can. So if I had that for the computational environment, there wouldn't be a cyber problem. Well,
there have been a couple companies that have started in the last few years, and that's been my area of research for the last 5. So
yeah.
it is coming out, but it.
So the reason the CERT was put at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon is that's where the capability maturity model was established. And everybody thought security was a maturity process. And I think we're seeing finally the maturity of protection mechanisms finally emerge, and we're starting to see it in places where it matters, and that has been where money is. And I'm hoping that same process will shift over into most of the rest of computing.
It's interesting to me, as you're saying this, because one of the things that I've taught my classes for a long time, that you often are presented with a choice, do what's profitable or do what's right. And it's very difficult sometimes to avoid doing what's profitable to do what's right if they are in conflict. But what you've been describing over time here is we've had two communities, really. There are a group that have to have it right because the consequences of failure can't be contemplated, even though those failure modes may be remote. So there, it is worth it to invest 19 years in building something, or in spending a huge amount of time and effort to build a model for how systems should be developed in the commercial marketplace. That's trying to do it right. Now, we can argue whether they were all correct or not, but that's different from making profitable.
So I think the culture has changed, unfortunately, and I think that the doing it right was taken more seriously back in the 70s than it is today. If you look at OPM, they could have encrypted that data.
They could have done a lot of things.
Right. But they didn't because it wasn't classified, so they weren't required to. It wasn't about doing it right. It was about compliance, doing what you have to do. And I see more and more today the government is relying on compliance, where you can talk to people like this with supply chain. We have ideas about things you can do to make that supply chain risk management problem harder for the adversary. And they say, well, that'd be great, but what do we have to do to be compliant with the regulations? We don't want to be better than we have to be.
Right.
And we always wanted to be the best we could be, not as good as we had to be to squeak by.
Good enough security.
Good enough.
Yeah,
Well,
that
and of
was,
course, a lot of, I'm sorry.
I was just going to make a footnote. The whole ISO 27001 successor to BS 7799, people would say, what's the minimum we can do to meet that and be secure? And the fact is that the people who developed 7799 were saying, this is the absolute bare minimum. In fact, they argued about whether disaster recovery should be even included in the standard because that was the last chance saloon. And if you got to the point where you had to do DR, then you had already lost. So yeah, there was a real perception. The people who developed it wanted to say, okay, this is a foundation on which you build, and what it ended up being was prescriptive. The closer you get to this ideal of a DR, that's hogwash. One area I wanted to mention, I was CTO of a company called WaveSet, an identity management startup. One of the discussions we had was whether we should do identity management in a commercial version. Right? I just moved, so I've got to change my subscriptions. I've got to change policies. I've got to inform banks and credit cards. I have an identity management problem, and I'm solving it manually. Is there money in that? Would you want to fund the help desk to deal with people who are having trouble with that solution? An interesting problem. I still think that there should be something out there, but I can't see a business case for it.
David, you had something you wanted to...
Yeah, I forgot what stimulated. It's a story. I was at a conference one time, and people were talking about the weakness of passwords. And a noted researcher, whose name will remain anonymous, said passwords are terrible. You should never use those. You should be using encryption or two-factor authentication. The person sitting next to me was in the security department for Coca-Cola, and they had been trying to get passwords mandatory. And somebody from the research community said, "No, I don't. If you can't do this high, don't do anything." And they were talking about two-factor authentication. I have to do two-factor authentication all the time now, not by my choice. If I use a different device and go to Schwab, they say, "Okay, you want us to send you email or do you want a text?" Could we do that 30 years ago? No. Couldn't do that. Two-factor authentication was something altogether different then. But the fact that everybody has got access to email and to their text all the time means that we actually, the Coca-Cola people now, can at least do two-factor authentication, and it could be routine. That's the story.
So there is hope here that some of the profit making is resulting in technology to our benefit. And certainly we shouldn't knock the idea of making a profit, because that really does underlie a lot of what we do and has driven some of the technological development. The question may be, as a field, we haven't been very good about impressing upon people the idea of doing it right rather than doing it fast. So Guy Kawasaki's idea of innovate quickly and break things, doesn't work very well in security. We don't really profit from having bad things pushed out to market that people adopt, and then we have to fix it and do the disaster recovery afterwards. And certainly in safety critical situations, yesterday's workshop on cyber physical systems and IoT, when some things break, that can result in loss of life, loss of property, international incidents, all kinds of things that are very bad. So we do see some industries that do a good job. So airline industry, pretty good, seems to be. And nuclear power certainly takes care. And that's where the costs are large. What is it we do based on experience, based on projection forward, to try to get other organizations to value individuals and large groups the way they value large-scale infrastructure that has to be protected?
Without some penalty, it's going to be very hard. There really is no penalty to a bank that loses 1 million credit cards for sale. It's one of those situations where people are interested in profit, and if there's no cost to them in doing the minimal, then it's hard to get them to do more. Common criteria is a minimal thing. This is the minimal level. Well, nobody really tries to exceed that. You remember when Microsoft took that 3-month period and said, we've got to start doing security. That was a big cost to them.
It was big change.
I think that was a big statement that they made to the industry, but I didn't see anybody else picking up on that.
Somebody gave the example, I think, one time about automobile safety. There were enough accidents enough times that they passed laws, state laws and some federal laws. And they started talking about what is necessary for building your automobile so that it is safe enough. And the companies, they fought it, they didn't like it, but when it was there, they engineered around it. And the statistics on automobile safety and injury has gone way down, and now it's normal. And we haven't found the leverage point to do it in the security.
And we've had some very big breaches along the way.
But it's a
Regularly.
that's a much simpler problem. It was very easy to model what was happening. Cars were running into each other, and
Well, and largely,
seatbelts.
largely in that case, you didn't have to say, here's the solution.
right.
What we said is, people will wear seatbelts that you will put in your car. And the other things were indirect. Okay, so now we protect the people. We will not have the crankshaft go through their chest. We'll crumple. Other people did the engineering. You're right, absolutely. It's a simpler situation. But we've never had the leverage to
Well, Mark
get things
alluded to
going.
that this morning when he said that the computer should protect the user. The user shouldn't be protecting the computer.
But things are getting a lot better. So the first cyber incidents I was involved with in 1983 was about stealing credit card numbers. And there was not a single word in the newspaper in 1983 about Equifax having every credit card in their database sucked out of it. Right?
So that's old news. It just keeps happening.
But it happened yesterday, and it happened last week. But the nice thing is that we're now more aware of it, and it's impacting us personally. My personal information was completely taken in the OPM breakdown because I have clearances. And so it wasn't my information. It was my wife's and my mother's and my father. Everybody who I had to report with all their Social Security numbers and everything are gone. So, but every individual now is becoming aware of how it can impact them. But I think it's because the internet has now become a part of everybody's life. Back in the 90s, the internet was only in the hands of academics and the government, you know, and maybe the telephone company, and that was it. But now it involves everybody in this room. And we're investing ourselves into the technology, and so we now have value in it, and it's now a personal threat. It may take 10 or 20 more years to where we find solutions, but I think we're in the middle of the curve, shifting it to where somebody's willing to pay for it.
The regulation to address those credit card losses has been against that you don't have to pay for the fraud. The banks pay for it. So there's no personal injury from that.
Right.
So I've had 2 credit cards violated so far this year. And I expect all of them will be stolen sometime this year.
Mhm.
But it doesn't hit me.
Mhm.
It cost me 4 days waiting for the replacement card to arrive. That's it.
But the other thing that drove the regulation with regard to cars was there were two steps that led to those laws. The first step was the publication of the book Unsafe at Any Speed, which Ralph Nader talked about the Corvair and how it was designed would flip over. And then when the Pinto blew up, and there was liability that led to not just a fine to the company, but the executives of Ford Motor Company were personally charged with manslaughter. And at that point, the automobile manufacturers said, look, if you can create some regulations that we can meet, that'll shield us from this kind of liability. So it was actually defensive. And what hasn't happened in IT was the concept of product liability. Any of you who are using a personal computer, do you know you're a hobbyist? From the point of view of the law, this is something you choose to do. It's a caveat emptor world for personal computer users right now. And that has to change. When you can bring a class action lawsuit against a vendor for providing you with technology that is unsafe, unreliable, then we'll begin to see, I think, serious regulation.
So what you're pointing out really is part of this is a kind of tragedy of the commons situation where anybody who does take a step forward and spends to do the better security, unless they're in a dominant position like Microsoft, is unlikely to be followed by anyone else because they're throwing their money away. They aren't going to get rewarded for it.
Right.
And that's a kind of an interesting issue where government normally has a role to play to move something forward. The second thing I want to extract out of that interchange that I think is interesting goes back to what you said earlier about the changing threat model. So if we go back 50 years ago, really the threat we were concerned with other than machine failure was an insider working for a foreign power. So we had a well-defined kind of adversary. Then we had, as
And it was Russia, not a foreign power.
it was just
It was
Russia.
Russia.
Well, it was the Soviet Union then.
Yeah.
And that was who we were worried about. And now, as we move forward, computers proliferated more data. It became more diffuse, including criminal elements and anarchists and political activists and hobbyists and people playing around with multics with cookie programs. But now, interestingly, we're back to a situation where everybody has some identified threats. Right? So we have advertisers who are getting into our Facebook accounts to steal our cat videos or other information. And we're back to the Russians interfering with our elections and other kinds of things that, had we had that posed 25 years ago, would actually be considered an act of war. And now we're so immune to having our systems broken into, it's kind of like, oh yeah, that as well. So we've seen some interesting changes over time, and I forget, Jerry, do we stop at half past or quarter of?
Quarter of.
Quarter till. Okay, good. So we have a little more time here. If any of you have some questions for the panel, if you line up at the microphone, we can take those. But what I was saying here about this changing threat picture as well is we're that frog in Mark's video in a lot of ways, that we have allowed this kind of abuse to increase without us being aggravated about it.
One of the things that I saw at the CERT, so I was there from 1989 to 1994 and was a part of the first buildup of an organization that wanted you to tell us about how you got broken into and things like that. Lots of involvement with law enforcement, lots of involvement with the military and the U.S. government. I came to realize in the first 2 years that this technology wasn't creating new crime. It wasn't creating new behaviors. It was simply amplifying and putting the biggest magnifying glass you could. There's still children that want to do graffiti. There's still young men that want to project their power in weird and interesting ways. Then there is the real criminal element, and there is the political element, and all these other things. And I think by giving this infrastructure, though, makes even the smallest little aggressive action gargantuan, because it has the ability to magnify it like a photo multiplier to a simple little interest, like the Morris worm. One little young student, father happened to work for the NSA, right? just happened to have some tools, wasn't quite sure. Did he do it on
It's
purpose?
not clear there was a relationship there.
Yeah, exactly. We don't really know what's going on, but the whole notion is that, oh, it got out and it crushed the entire world, you know. And even some simple, insignificant actions have massive consequences when this infrastructure has now been put in place. And so I'm not sure that I understand the threat model. I do know the threat impact is completely changed. And I think that's the most interesting academic sort of thing, is that I think the threats are the same. I just think the consequences are much different.
I would imagine we would all tend to agree that a lot of older crimes have taken on new personas. There are some, I think, that are relatively new, though, because of the widespread communication. Trolling is a really good example. Trolling and online harassment. It was very difficult to inconvenience someone to the extent without that volume. And some kinds of trolling are brand new. But yeah, I might have difficulty thinking of other kinds of new crimes with computers. We have some people with the microphone. So.
Hi, I'm Fred Scholl. I have a comment and a question. One of my comments has to do with Mr. Malik's comment. I saw there's a case in federal court in Detroit in which some citizens did not receive the right benefits that they were supposed to receive. And there's now a class action lawsuit against both the software company and the provider, which I thought was pretty interesting. But my question has to do with, are there lessons learned that the panelists would want to, share with the audience of what we could do differently in the next few years?
Take it, guys.
Oh, yeah. There are tons of lessons. You do have to take the adversary seriously. Back when it was us and the Russians, we had rules of engagement. And we followed those rules scrupulously. Even the Russians aren't following those rules now because it's an escalation game. As more people got into the game and started ignoring the rules, the Russians found that they could ignore the rules too. You've got to stop it at step one, or else it's going to move to step 2 and step 3 and step 4. If you let it just get out of control, it's happy to. And the lesson is we should have stopped it at day 1. And when it was us in Russia, we should just come to some kind of an agreement that, hey, look, this is going to be bad. It's not like a nuclear weapon where we are the ones that have that nuclear weapon. Anybody can do this. And as we use that, we share those tools, those attack vectors, with everybody else in the world. It's a completely different game. And if we had realized that at day 1, we would be in a much better position today.
One of the areas that we still have trouble with is thinking in terms of exponential growth. We've mentioned it a few times. I used to do capacity planning mainframe systems. Exponential growth works like this. You've got a lily pond. It's going to be, on day 1, it's got 1 lily pad. On day 2, it's got 2. You know that on day 30, it'll be full. The difficulty of thinking exponentially is to look at that lily pad on day 27 and see all that water, right? Because it's 7/8 clear, and think, we're dead in 3 days. Exponential growth is really, really tough to comprehend, and yet it is Moore's law is the parameter, it's the drumbeat of our industry.
Neil?
Okay. So there's a fascinating discussion by you guys, and there's so many things I'd like to ask about. But I think I'll riff off Bill's recent remark about exponential growth, right? There were a lot of trends that if we look back today, we can see them starting in the 70s or 80s or 90s. Which of those can you point to where we haven't reached we're one day from filling the pond yet, and we can actually sort of maybe do something about it, right? The ones where we're somewhere to still riff off Bill's analogy, we're day 20 or 25, and we have something we could still do, and then what would you do about it?
I'll take the cheap and easy answer. Quantum computing is going to really mess up everything we do, because all of our commerce, all of our online banking, it all relies on RSA, Diffie-Hellman. We got to get our tails in gear and fix that now, because we do have time. The quantum computers are not going to be at the scale that's going to be able to attack crypto for a few years. We can't wait those few years, because it's going to take us a long time to roll out whatever we want to roll out. So we've got to do that now.
I'll bet you $1 that it's less than a few years. I've been playing with the.
Well,
Do you need anybody to hold that?
few, yeah, here you go. Few could be,
Well, I've been in.
few
I've been
could be
in-
three. It's
Yeah,
not going to be in three.
It's not going to be, well, it might,
It's been 20 for about 40 years now.
well, it's not like fusion, which has been, 30 years away for
Right,
60 years.
right.
But I've been playing with the quantum computing thing on the IBM site. You can build a program that does 5-bit quantum computing. I still haven't got my mind around the algorithm that cracks factoring large numbers. I'm close. I know it comes down to the quantum Fourier transform, but I can't tell you how it works yet. The point is that the more qubits you can put together, the easier the problem is to solve. And Google just announced, I think it was a 71 or a 72 qubit device. I mean, IBM was like 15 or 16, and then I heard something about 30, and all of a sudden we're in the 70s. I think when you get to 3 digits, then Diffie-Hellman is toast.
No, you got to get to somewhere around 1 trillion, I think.
Qubits?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in that case, I'll.
Yeah, take your It turns out the problem's harder than they really thought it was, and there's too much uncertainty in the calculations, which grows as the size of the computer grows. These are all probabilistic. Quantum computers don't get it right. They get it right with some probability, and that makes it really hard.
And there's a lot of error propagation, so you got to have an additional number of qubits to be able to deal with the error.
To clear the errors, yeah.
Yeah.
I took a probability seminar my freshman year. Norm Ankeny taught statistics at MIT, and he ran a little seminar on, it was actually poker, a very expensive seminar on probability statistics. Learned a lot. The second thing I learned is if you haven't figured out who the fish is by the third hand, it's you.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the presentation earlier today. It had a lot of really good stuff in it, but I just did disagree on one thing: the notion that the cloud will help to mitigate some of our security issues. All right, the cloud is going to introduce new security problems. The fact that I can virtualize my physical infrastructure now and stick it on that machine means if somebody's not careful, they can copy my entire infrastructure just like that. Had I not put it in the cloud, I had huge protections because it was in my company. It was behind my door. You had to have a key to get to it. But people aren't talking about the transition and modernization and how that by itself brings new vulnerabilities and new issues. And so the things that we should be able to do are to remember the past and learn from and don't believe anything anybody says about how something new is going to provide a maturity process to what we have today. Because the whole concept of having something new means it's going to have new problems, new issues, new vulnerabilities, and just new.
Specifically IoT devices. I would really like it if IoT devices had the capability for encryption, the capability for key exchange, capability for identification, authentication, both device to device and device to person. I moved into a new apartment and I've got the home thing, the dial that tells me a number, and I don't know if it's telling me the temperature or assessing my IQ.
But as soon as you put a crypto chip in it, now it can be used to mine Bitcoin. So if I can get every Chinese camera in the world to mine Bitcoin, it's a chain, right?
Well, and the reason there isn't security in most IoT is too small, right? Not worth being a target, and too small to put stuff in. But we've now got fairly powerful technologies, and I'd like to see some thought to security. I believe, and Bruce Schneier made a similar comment a couple of years ago, that eventually we're going to have government regulation that says old IoT devices must be disconnected or ashcan, that you just can't have that stuff, that dangerous stuff out there.
In 10 years, that capability will be there. One of the guys did a calculation. If you look at all the bombs that were used, the BOMBE, the bombs that were used to attack Enigma in World War II, and if you look at all of the bombs that were used by the U.S. and the UK throughout the war, it was 10 seconds on an iPhone.
Yeah, let me add a comment from my perspective before we get to the microphone. From my experience, looking at where regulations come from, and largely they come from people with backgrounds in law or marketing experience. They don't come from technologists. You look at a lot of major advisory positions in government, and they tend to be business leaders or people who've been successful as legislators and they, like 90% of our legislators have law degrees. I think that if we are going to succeed, one of the things, and this goes to Neil's question, is we have to start taking more of a leadership and policy role as a community rather than simply building the technology. We have to be more aggressive about getting forward that idea of what is right rather than what makes the most money. And putting that kind of thought process in place. It's not simply technology that works in isolation. It is technology that affects the world.
I'll tell Rob Joyce that you're validating his choice to go downtown.
I have actually said that to him, and I think it's worthwhile. But more of us need to do it.
Yeah, that was one of the points I wanted to make, is that doing the right thing versus regulation, because regulation is always catching up after we've had bad things happening. We're never going to solve the problems if we're always doing catch-up. We've got to be proactive. We've got to be out in front of this. But I think one of the other things that we're really continue to do a disservice to our InfoSec students as we're trying to grow up this whole community is we're not teaching them how to talk about risk so that the business can understand the risk that they're really taking on. The more that you can do that, we're finding that the executives are able to take it to the board and they're able to do the right thing more often instead of doing the wrong thing because they understand the risk and the real cost to them bottom line.
Yeah, security is not a problem with the technology. It's where technology is used in the overall process.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment triggered by your comment just now that cloud introduces new vulnerabilities, but also they do provide new security tools that were not feasible in the physical enterprise. For example, the notion of a security group. You can associate a security group with every host in AWS, and this is like a distributed personal firewall that you can attach to every host, but that's infeasible in the physical world.
Well, actually, the U.S. government has CDM and HBSS, so every in-system in the entire Defense Department has had that technology in it for 10, 15 years.
Right.
So that architecture actually has been done long before clouds were up.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But
And it's inadequate. And everybody understands
Right.
currently in the current infrastructure that deployment of protection structure based on the expectation of threat is the fallacy. And that all the protection you have doesn't do anything for 0 day. And so that whole approach, the cloud has a new solution. No, it definitely solves the problem of having consistent administration, good updates on software. It's a great environment to make sure you're squeaky clean and you're doing the best that you possibly can. But it has, in its own right, major problems. One thing that I tell a lot of people is when they buy their own private cloud and stick it in their infrastructure, that cloud represents the biggest torch in their entire infrastructure. It's got 10,000 cores in it with 4 10-gig interfaces on it so that everybody can get to it. If somebody attacked that cloud, it could just destroy the infrastructure. And nobody thinks about that. So how do you when are you going to cut that cloud out of the infrastructure? How are you going to respond when the big bad thing happens and you have a course of action that says, I got to turn that thing off? And that's the kind of stuff that are the new things that are coming out in a realization that I'm concentrating a lot of power into a small space. It has its own curiosities and its own issues that have to be dealt with. I hate to jump on you, but I didn't want you to, to present the notion that old ideas in a new box are going to make something really.
Well, right. But it is far more practical now to have a distributed firewall for the enterprise. I don't know, maybe for DoD, they already have that. The other aspect is the out-of-band network, that AWS provides to manage all of your infrastructure. And that is all managed by AWS. So therefore, the chances of somebody compromising it are low, assuming AWS knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. It's a great start at trying to do a little bit better.
Makes it better.
But like I said, it's an old bag of tricks in a new box. And it's hard to say that brings out a totally unique sort of way to deal with cybersecurity.
Thanks. And so we'll do one more question. And appropriately, Josh Corman is going to be our closing keynote. So we'll let him have the last question for the panel.
Sort of piggybacking off of yours comment. There are exactly 2 computer science majors in the staff of the House in Congress. This room could maybe try to change that. I found both of them. They're really good to work with. Second, I think Rob Joyce is a good addition, but we need more of that. And one of the things we have to change in this room for the next 20 years is we turn our nose up to any sort of legislation or regulatory. We have a default allergy to that, and I think that's healthy, but I also think we have to be more of a helping hand than a pointing finger. And one last thing, and I definitely want to corner all of you later, is what really resonated with your comment, William, was the idea of philosophical fundamentals and foundations. We don't really have first principles. And I've looked at this as the traditional social contract has eroded, and maybe it's my philosophy background, but I think we kind of need a cyber social contract for this generation. And to that end, we don't really have a JSONs type function for cyber. And I would love to maybe, I've been teasing the edges of a cyber JSONs. And I would love to, the 5 of you to consider maybe being founding members of that. But we need the new generation getting into public policy with technology literacy. But we also need the older generation to tell us what do we really want between the relationship between technology and the human condition. So please find me.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I believe the panel are going to be around for most of the symposium and would welcome your questions and comments during a break or out in the hallway. We very much appreciate your attention. And now Joel is going to tell you about lunch.
Correct. Thank you to the panelists.